took up his position in July 2012, 2 years after this office, EPLO was established. He was until 2012 the head of the Human Rights Unit within the Secretariat General of the European Parliament. Jeremy Kinsman, welcome again. He spoke last night, a wonderful presentation. Jeremy Kinsman has been engaged by the European Political Project and by the Canada-EU journey from his first assignment in 1968 as the political officer at the Startup Mission to the EEC. After a decade in New York and Washington and service as political director in the Foreign Ministry, he returned to Europe in 1992 as Canadian ambassador, successively in Moscow, Rome, London, High Commissioner, and then from 2002 to 2006, ambassador to the EU itself, when Canada became one of the EU's designated 6 strategic partners, especially on a shared human security agenda and processes of negotiating a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement was launched under his watch. Last but certainly not least, we have Frederic Merand, and he's a professor of political science at the University of Montreal. I asked him if he wanted more of an introduction, and he said everyone knew him, so it would be fine. So please welcome and join me in welcoming Manfred Auster.
Well, thank you very much for that. And my apologies, first of all, that I was late for the party yesterday evening. Nevertheless, happy Europe Day to you, even though it's already the 10th of May. We had one in Ottawa as well, obviously, which was nicely attended, among other people also by Foreign Minister Dion, as has become now kind of a trademark for us. Greetings, obviously, from the ambassador, Marianne Konings, who is in Toronto today to celebrate Europe Day there a little bit belatedly. And also her thanks to EXA, basically, for the work that you're doing over the turn of the years, basically the academic years, in spreading the message about the European Union and discussing it with what I think is critical sympathy. And that is certainly the approach that we cherish and think is also an approach that is necessary from time to time. First of all, then, or second of all, kind of disclaimer. Yes, I've been introduced as the number 2 of the mission in Ottawa. Nevertheless, not everything that I'm going to say now on the discussion is reflecting what our headquarters are necessarily having published. Most of it hopefully will, but that on record is something that we should do as well. So, 40 years has been mentioned. That is our anniversary year, which allows us to celebrate it and do a number of public outreach activities. And it is 40 years, as you have heard, of the framework agreement and also of the EU delegation to Ottawa as a diplomatic mission. My own experience is roughly 10% of those 40 years. It's 4 years with the delegation, and then there's a plus of another 3 years that I spent in Ottawa as a member states diplomat, and therefore also followed the work of the delegation a bit. So if you like, later on, and you want to hear a little bit about the nitty-gritty of what we're doing, most welcome to ask us questions. I'm trying to respond to those. 40 years back, what was it like then? So you will remember probably Cold War, yes, but also the Ostpolitik was something that was relatively new, that led to the CSCE, and just 1 year before we start our counting of from 1976, 1975, the Helsinki Final Act, which was probably in the CSCE process one of the milestones, and also arguably something that set motions or wheels in motion that led to a complete shift in the European political landscape a few decades later. What else? It was 3 years after the oil crisis. ABBA was still together. Bell-bottom pants. My son chipped in and said Atlantic 10 Swim Conference was founded 40 years ago. So now guess what kind of sport he's doing. Apple was founded in 1976. There was a bizarre regime still in Albania that claimed to fight the 3 superpowers. And China tried to get rid of the Gang of Four, we back in the country that I know best, which is Germany, had to deal with the Baader-Meinhof and the second generation of the terrorists there. Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State in your neighboring country, and he was still looking for the European telephone number. And then there was the Middle East, but I mean, the Middle East never changes, I'm afraid. Closer to home, 1976 in Canada. Montreal, the Olympics. The CNN Tower was inaugurated. There was another Trudeau as a prime minister. Canada joined 6 other states, which hence are called the G7. And the EU. And another disclaimer, perhaps I might use the EU synonymously also for the predecessors of the Union, which at those times had different names, unless I specified. So in 1976, we were 9. We were just 1 year after another referendum on an island member state. That one went pro-Europe. And there were first timid steps, but not more than that, towards foreign policy of the Euro communities, as they were called then. That was the European Political Cooperation, something that was only going to be codified into our legal texts roughly 10 years later in the Single European Act. And that was the setting then. In this one, the delegation of the European Commission was the third one globally that was opened in Ottawa. Well, not the third in Ottawa, but the third globally. And this third one was opened in Ottawa as being the diplomatic mission, or actually at that stage you might have heard of the representation of the Commission, so only of the institution that deals with the Union competencies. Now fast forward, 2016. We are now a European Union of 28. We have a mandate for CFSP. And I guess in these circles, I don't have to spell out the acronyms. So we have a mandate for CFSP, and that includes, obviously, CSTP. We have a High Representative, Vice President of the Commission for Foreign Policy and Security. We have the European External Action Service, or in one of the languages that are equally legally binding in the treaties, translated into Europäischer Auswärtiger Dienst, European Foreign Service. So that is the institution I'm working for. Nowadays we have 139 delegations as in diplomatic missions globally, worldwide. And we have, yes, we have 10 more or less strategic partners, more or less not in the sense of numbers, but in the strategic element of that, or also in how we want to define strategic interests. There are some of us who shy away from the figure 10. I don't actually, because I think all 10 of them are, for strategic reasons, very important to us, but they are very, very heterogeneous as a group. And Canada is certainly one, if not the one, that is the closest to us in the sense of values, history, culture, and all that. So Canada is one of these 10 global strategic partners, as you know, of the European Union. It is, I believe, important to note that under this concept of strategic partners that has evolved over the decades of our relationship, we widened the aspect and the approach of what we were doing. As I said, when the delegation opened in 1976, it was one that was pretty much linked to the competences of the Commission then, and the most outstanding one was and still is trade, and that's why in other groups and other discussions we heard so much about CETA. But we have developed from there, and that certainly makes quite a bit of sense. The relation with the European institutions started early. That started even before '76. It started in the 1950s, but it was then with this crucial year in which the then Prime Minister Trudeau very much put emphasis on the fact that we needed to institutionalize the relations more, that we started to discuss, to negotiate the framework agreement on economic and commercial cooperation, which is also 40 years now. And if we say we started negotiating it 40 years back, and it is 40 years now, it means we not only started it, but we also concluded the negotiations, and we ratified the thing all in 1 year. Mind my words. So perhaps it was slightly easier then than now, but nevertheless we achieved that, and that gave, we in later years tended to shorten the title in everyday practice to framework agreement, and used it also as one that is that provided us for the basis for more closer cooperation. Nevertheless, we must say that it is by now, 40 years later, fast forward and all that, outdated, and therefore we had started the strategic partnership agreements negotiations, which came to conclusion 2 years ago with the summit that we had in 2014. Just 2 weeks before that, it was initialed by the High Rep and by the Foreign Minister of Canada. We are intending to sign the thing this year in autumn, when we are planning the next summit. The treaty text itself was never controversial on the European side. Obviously, negotiations is a process that develops, but that the text was never controversial. The question that you might ask, why isn't the thing then enforced yet, has more to do with internal EU arguments about the way that we are going to implement it provisionally until such a time when the whole process of ratification is through. So what I'm trying to say is the fact that we have an agreement that encompasses a wide area of cooperation between Canada and the EU, reaching from human rights disarmament, in projecting these elements, in projecting also peace and security globally together as partners, to environment, to consumer protection, some elements, to cultural get-togethers, student exchanges, youth mobility. Such a wide-ranging area of topics is not controversial between the two partners, and is something that we want to implement soon, that we're going forward with. It also provides us with a structure to do that. It is not that it hasn't been, that we didn't have the structure before, but they are modernized, put forward onto a level that makes, that takes into account the new arrangements that we have in the European Union with the treaty arrangements since Lisbon, and also will hopefully streamline and make it more, make it easier for that one. What we are doing nowadays is we're working together in the spirit of SPA. Let's say wherever in the text itself, which is, by the way, public, as you probably know, wherever we say we want to promote, we want to go forward, we want to intensify our relation in these elements, we take that up already and sit together on officials levels or on political levels to find ways to twist it, to do that. Just one of the practical examples that we discussed in one of the other conferences in the context of the 40th anniversary on the Common Security and Defense Policy is the missions and operations that Canada is participating in. Those are EU military or civilian missions that are trying to do the whole range of conflict management, starting from capacity building to post-conflict prevention, but also to more robust things like the fight against piracy off the coast of Somalia, which was pretty successful and has reduced the rate of piracy there tremendously, or to places like Ukraine, where Canada is also a member of and participating with personnel in the EU advisory mission on security sector reform. So that's only as an example of what we are doing there, and that has been debated there. But there are other elements. Climate change is certainly something that needs to be mentioned in that context. Canada is back, as the Prime Minister has said after his election. Canada was instrumental in pooling together with the European Union in Paris to reach for the ambitious goals that we have certified, that we have concluded there. Actually, Canada was one of those partners pushing for the less than 2 degrees aim, which is also clearly indicating where we need to go on that particular element. There are more almost going into the trade relation already. Were you looking at your watch? Someone was? Good. I'm coming to it, but I just want to mention energy as well, which goes hand in hand with climate change and the environment. Energy certainly has effects that are not necessarily positive, at least as long as it is done in the sense of carbon-based energy forms, but then there are also mitigation possibilities for that. The Arctic is another one that we are working pretty closely together on. Some of you might remember the controversy that we had a few years back on the question whether Canada would agree to make the European Union an observer at the Arctic Council, which we consider the predominant forum for Arctic cooperation. Excuse me. That has been solved since the last summit in 2014 already, and cooperation goes forward. We just published a communication by the Commission to the Parliament and the Council on the next steps in the Arctic policy of the European Union. And Minister Tutu was in Brussels a day or two after that, and also was pretty full of praise for that piece of information, and that is quite a bit in a contrast to what we have seen when the first publications came out. Those were only tiny spots that I wanted to throw out there as a teasers for our discussions. I might just look up the latest thing that Juncker said recently about our relationship. President Juncker said, "It is vital that those who share values of freedom, of democracy, and of human rights continue to deepen their cooperation." And what he meant is certainly also to do that with Canada, and so we shall. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Manfred. Is the mic working? Yes? Okay. Well, you reminded me that I was also born in 1976.
Hey, there you go.
So I'm as old as the Canada-EU relationship. That may explain why I decided to invest so much time and energy studying that topic. We don't have much time, so I'll ask 2 questions to Manfred, one to Jeremy, one to Geoffrey, to which the other panelists may want to contribute, and then I hope we'll still have a little bit of time for questions and answers. And I count on Alexandra to tell me when we should cut the conversation. Starting with Manfred, so I worked in Ottawa in 2004, and I remember we used to receive emails from Ambassador Kinsman about how great it was that Canada had been selected as a strategic partner. And I must say that I always wondered whether that mattered or not, whether it's just one of those terms that diplomats like to use, but doesn't have any tangible consequence. Or you showed some of the important consequences, I think, in your talk. But it's true that during the conservative era, I think it would be hard to say that a lot happened under that front. And now with CETA is taking so much space in the Canada-EU relationship, which is a good thing. But it leaves me to wonder, what will happen to the strategic partnership? So the question is, from your European perspective, personal but also institutional, do you see any untapped opportunities, places where maybe Canada seems to be reluctant, or the EU itself has not yet brought forward ideas to really make that strategic partnership not only a tangible thing, but something big, something that people will notice?
Well, one side of that probably is the people will notice question. The other one is the one of meaningful strategic partnership. They don't have necessarily to go together, I would argue. The strategic partnership is not only about summit meetings. that goes much deeper, and I think I alluded a little bit to that already. We have numerous dialogues on high official level where we compare notes and then also coordinate, be it on human rights, be it on security and defense, be it on regional elements like the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, fight against terrorism. There are all these specialists coming together so that we basically have at least once a month one of these pretty specialized dialogues. And they are then, on top of that, we have also the meetings of the political directors, which come together a little bit less often, but usually twice a year. And then OGDs, as my friends in Ottawa would say, other government departments. The Commission has all kinds of exchanges too. Not saying that you need to be a strategic partner to do that, but the level of this interaction that we see between Canada and the EU, I think, is a consequence of that strategic partnership that we cherish and have. I don't see that CETA would necessarily be kind of competitor to that one. Coming from the ES and the foreign policy family, we argue that the SPA, the Strategic Partnership Agreement, is in a way a kind of umbrella for the overall relationship between us. And CETA would be one of the major pillars under it. Even if there's no legal direct link between the two, one sets the scene for what we want to achieve, and then it's quite logical that economic and trade relations figure highly between two G7 partners, and hence CETA is the logical consequence of the fact that we want to get closer together, and then, if you like, with Chrystia Freeland's words, to set a gold standard for the world in that.
Jeremy, you were there at the creation, so to speak, and anything to add?
You know, I agree with Manfred that what the summits do is they set an agenda for the machinery. They set goals, and people have to work according to a timetable in order to get some output for the next summit and the next communique, and so in that sense they're a discipline. I think the most important thing you said about it is that Canada and the European Union had a symmetry of feeling about the world, and that's what explained it. But at the end, it comes down to people. I went through summits summits that were meant to be summits with Jean Chrétien, for example. Some worked and some didn't. Berlusconi didn't come. The Greek prime minister they were in a crisis of some kind, you know, and there was no connection. Yet with others, the Prime Minister of Denmark, with Romano Prodi, it was terrific. So it matters very much on the connection between the leaders. When Justin Trudeau got elected, and in fact, on the way to getting elected, is this being recorded, by the way?
Yes, there's a camera there. Go ahead.
Well, you know, he's your age. He's 3 years older than you are, and I'm not, right? And that crowd, a nice, terrific bunch of advisors, are also your age, and they instinctively don't look to an immediate connection with the generation from before. That's particularly true in Canadian politics, but it's also possibly reasonably humanly true about who you connect to out there. And I'm interested that he is connecting personally, very strongly, of course, to Barack Obama, but to other leaders in whom he sees a kind of reflection of himself. The Prime Minister of Italy, for example. They're roughly the same age. But I hope that he will connect also. You know, Juncker is my age, but he's kind of a funny, colorful guy. And I would hope that they would have a relationship. At the end of the day, as you know, Frederic, it is a question of when you have an issue, who do you call? You know, who do you talk to? Who do you talk to about what Putin's done last week? Or who calls you? And you call somebody not just because you have a strategic partnership, you call them because you want to talk to them. And that's very fundamental in international politics. I think it would absolutely be true. The one person he hit off remarkably well with was Angela Merkel, for example. That's counter-indicated in terms, well, she's not that much older after all, but she is older. Anyway, I didn't want to get into an ageist thing, but I just wanted to emphasize personal connections are really the most important currency in international relations.
What about the other side, Manfred? We know that Trudeau is very, I mean, I'm often in Brussels and you know, everybody talks about our new Prime Minister. But beyond personalities, what do Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk think about Canada, if they think about Canada at all? I mean, what's their perception of our country and also our relationship?
Well, my direct encounters with the two presidents is limited as years, I guess. So that's a little bit of speculation. But if I take that as cum grano salis, I would say the fact that they meet on these G7 summits and also the ministers meet on the specified special meetings of the G7 is already bringing it constantly to their awareness that Canada is a very important partner in that game and that Canada has something to do. If you like, there might have been the one or other irritant in that group when the G7 became a real G8, when Russia dropped out. Well, there's now high mathematics. That is because in the G7 formula, the EU is not included, even though the EU is always at the table, right? So there's 7 nations plus the EU is a G7 and not a G8, for what reason ever. So what I'm trying to say in hidden words is when Russia was dropped out of that by basically a consensus, that was something that the previous government in Canada was pushing very hard for. And that, again, for better for worse, was probably something that was noted. And the current foreign policy philosophy that describes and saying, well, we need to engage important partners is certainly something that is much more on the mind of European leaders than an empty chair policy.
Switching to a topical issue, the flavor of the month, Brexit. Geoffrey, you're in Washington. It's quite rare that a US president or a Canadian prime minister will take a stand on the internal affairs of a European country. Barack Obama did, with regards to Brexit, took a very strong stand in favor of the UK remaining in the EU. Well, the question is to you, but again, maybe Manfred and Jeremy will want to add a more Canadian perspective. What did you do to convince the White House to say something? If you did anything, did you see that as a good thing? In other words, do you expect that other world leaders will also take a strong position in favor of European unification?
Those of you who have spoken to me already since I've been here in Halifax will probably have noticed that I'm not very strong in the langue de bois department. So I'm not going to highlight any role, since I don't have one, in influencing the White House. You mentioned Brexit as being the flavor of the month. It is one of various signs of challenge, profound challenge to the future of the European Union. And it's something which has been building up in my country almost since just after our last referendum, when Mrs. Thatcher came to power and came up originally with a problem over Britain's contribution to the budget, and then came into a very direct clash with the President of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, about the Euro project and about the powers of the institution. So it may be the flavor of the month, but it's something that's been building up for years, and many analysts would say actually this goes right back to the very foundation of the European coal and steel community, the EEC. The assumption was, well, we'll press ahead, and anyway, Britain will eventually wake up and join us. Perfectly logical approach, but some of the problems with that are still with us. As for Mr. Obama's intervention in the referendum campaign, since that's what it was, it certainly was an unusual event, although I don't remember this. I read somewhere that Gerald Ford did intervene in the 1975 referendum, but I honestly remember the intervention of Helmut Schmidt much more strongly than I do remember any intervention by Gerald Ford. So the intervention took place. For the moment, there is no sign that it had a particular impact on public opinion, but these things are always very difficult to judge. There are differences of opinion as to whether it diminished or enhanced the grip of the Prime Minister on public opinion, because these things can always be sort of read both ways, but certainly it was his duty on behalf of the leadership of his country to point out how much the US has riding on political stability in Europe, and why, as the Prime Minister echoed just yesterday, peace and stability in Europe does rather depend on the British people voting to remain in. Although there's one rather interesting moment, for reasons best known to himself, the Mayor of London, as was, the rather conservative Boris Johnson, who's now been replaced by the Social Democratic Labour Muslim Mayor, Sadiq Khan, chose to attack the president, making some reference to the fact that he didn't really believe in America because his antecedents were from somewhere else, which is a complicated discussion which goes on even in this country. But one, so happens, a black member of parliament from London, Diane Abbott, was asked, what do you and she's on the pro-Europe side, now that the left and the Labour Party are united on a pro-Europe position. She was asked, what do you think the president's intervention will make a big difference? She said, well, I don't think it will make a huge difference, but I'm certain that everybody will be shocked by the statement by Boris Johnson about the president's Kenyan ancestry. So on balance, she welcomed it, but by itself, it wasn't a transformative event, but it's certainly in the whole history, and in this very uncertain moment, it was a very important intervention. Of course, the president himself, by doing that, has invested a lot of credit in something. So both for his leadership, let alone for Britain's place in Europe, we have to hope that the British people do vote to stay in the European Union.
Jeremy, should Canadians care about Brexit?
I don't know. Do you care? The polling.
Does the government care?
Polling, I think the Angus Reid Institute did a poll, and it said that Canadians wanted Europe to stay in, I think, 6-4. Should the government say something? You know, it's not, ce n'est pas évident in some ways. We should, if we are at all honest about ourselves. It was Bill Clinton who, in the run-up to the 1993, 1996, when the hell was that thing? 95. He gave a speech at Tremblant, you remember? Even though you were only 4, you remember.
It was the first time I voted.
Okay, so you're older.
You don't want to know who I voted for.
I don't want to know. Don't tell me.
4, yeah.
Stay as sweet as you are. Okay. Anyway, Clinton. It was a very important moment. I know that Chrétien was very happy. Mulroney always welcomed Reagan's underlining of the importance of Canadian unity. So you'd think we would do the same for Europe. Is it the same? I remember. It's interesting, Manfred. I was at a G7 political directors meeting in London after Maastricht and after the Danes had voted against it, the referendum. And Gerhard was your G7 political director, and he wanted us very much to have in the communique that the G7 supported Maastricht. And to his horror, we and the Americans and the Japanese said, no, it's your business. It's not our business, it's your business. So whose business is it? What Obama said, which was true and harsh, but true, is that anybody in Britain who thinks that Britain would have the same relationship with the United States after as they do now is deluded. He actually said you'll be at the back of the queue for trade agreements. I don't think we would say that because we, for God's sake, for better or for worse, we have the same monarch. I don't think we could say something like that. We are going to have to say, much as any parent says, when your child says that I'm going to marry this person recently charged with murder, but he's a lovely person, and so you say, darling, I'll always love you no matter what you do. Well, I think we're sort of in that position vis-a-vis Britain. I think that we have to say, you know, whatever you do, whatever stupid, dumb thing you do, we're going to be there. You're our friend for these many centuries. I think that's so. That being said, I think candor does require probably the Prime Minister to say that, look, at the end of the day, we want a strong Europe. And one thing is objectively, factually, indubitably true. Europe is stronger with Britain in it than with Britain out of it. And that, I think you can say, you should say, and it should be understood. But I don't think it changes anybody's mind in Britain.
Probably not.
Okay? As to whether you say the other part of it, that Britain will be weaker out of it than in it, it seems to me that that is entering something that maybe isn't your business. So I don't know. I don't know how many people agree with that. But anyway.
Anything to add, Manfred, before we move to the question?
No, I pretty much agree with the latest one, and I would say everyone who watches and then listens to arguments doesn't need to be spelled out the latter consequence because it's so obvious. So if you say Europe is stronger with Britain in, well, you can draw your conclusions from what it means for Britain not being in as well. So, and that should be done elected by the people themselves. And I mean, for good reasons, we introduced the clause to leave the European Union first in the constitutional treaty that didn't come to bear, but it's now in the Lisbon Treaty. So that is.
Can I just add one other thing? You know, the Canadians know that these referenda, particularly for us from Quebec, are terrible things. They're the nuclear weapons of politics. They're very destructive. They destroy relationships. They sever families. I think the one thing you have to connote, it's a bit like when a marriage breaks up, you're going to be friends of both of them after. I think it's important to let them know that whatever they do, whatever either side do, that you are going to have relationships, strong relationships with both. We will have a strong relationship with the European Union, whether Britain's in it or whether it's out of it, you know.
All right, so unless I'm told otherwise, we have a few minutes for questions. I think you can simply raise your hand and... Oh, we have a mic, okay, good. Don't be shy. Yes, Oliver. No, actually, Madame first, in the back. Yeah, go ahead.
Is it working? So, my name is Agnieszka Bejnar. I'm a visiting scholar at Carleton University, but I'm also at the European University Institute. And I have two observations because I felt inspired by your discussion here. So, first on Brexit, you are talking a lot about UK, but I have been in Canada for 2 years, and I realized that this country has a strong relationship with at least 2 European countries. This is UK and this is France. France will stay, UK maybe will leave. What will be the impact on the Canadian politics on that? So I'm really curious. And another thing, I was thinking about this age thing you were talking about, and I wanted to say that I would love to have more sunny ways in Europe. Also, and I'm very happy that Mr. Trudeau likes Mr. Renzi. I don't know how many of you watched last week. There was this debate of the three EU presidents in Rome. Probably none of you. I did, and that was the most dismal thing I've ever seen in my life. I had Mr. Juncker and Mr. Schulz talking about old good days without giving any hint about the future of Europe. How it was easy when we all wanted Europe in the past. That was the main message. And I was like, oh my God, this is really terrible. Where is future? And then we had Mr. Tusk, who didn't know what he was talking about because he doesn't know anything about Europe. I'm Polish, so I assure you. So the thing is, the only person that actually had a bright, charismatic view of the future was Matteo Renzi, who was a host of that meeting in Rome. And honestly, I think that this is a time when we let this generation talk, but it's very hard in Europe. So maybe some observations on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnieszka. So we have a question about France and about sunny ways. Yes?
Maybe I take the second observation first. I have heard about this debate. I haven't seen it, and certainly it's not for me to comment on the quality of the inputs of any of the presidents. But I think what you're saying about Mr. Renzi, and I don't make a judgment about him because he's also an insecure political position, so he may or may not be a permanent part of the European political landscape. The one thing I would say about Italy is that whereas 1,000% of people in Italy believed in the European Union as a great idea when I started my career around 40 years ago, that does not appear to be the case. And Mr. Salvini, a leader of a major political force in Italy, actually got himself received by Mr. Trump, who was wise enough not to receive Mrs. Le Pen, but he turned up in Pennsylvania and they got themselves photographed together. So what you're saying about generational change, and I would say this is a tip to all of you professional political scientists, you've put your finger on probably what is the biggest challenge: managing the Eurozone, dealing with Russia, the terrible impact of the Arab awakening, the war in Syria. That's not manageable either. But developing a meaningful narrative for a new generation of Europeans is not easy. It was never easy. And even the arguments yesterday in Britain about what the Second World War means in relation to Brexit, these will go on forever. But for France, for Germany, for Italy, for Spain, for most of the countries of Eastern Europe, the idea of Europe was something which you could take for granted, even if you didn't like a particular policy or other, because anything is better than what came before. But as people forget what came before and only see a rather grey and messy reality, there is the risk that they will lose faith in the project. So whether others, such as Mr. Renzi, will appear on the scene remains to be seen, but that is absolutely essential. Whoever becomes President of the United States in January, it's going to be hard for them to stand there on the steps of the newly refurbished Capitol and say the torch has passed to a new generation, because they're all around 70, the three remaining candidates. But that is literally what Europe needs, and that may be, if and when the situation settles down with regard to Great Britain and we look towards the renewal of the European leadership in 2019, I would be optimistic that there are enough people like Mr. Renzi who realize, okay, this generation, they did a really good job, but we have to not reinvent the system, but we need to have a meaningful narrative based, of course, on certain historical lessons, but also addressing the genuine issues that we have in the future. As for France, I won't comment on Franco-Canadian relations. I would only say if Britain votes to leave, there will be overwhelming pressure on the French political elite to cede the question of a referendum in France. And I would point out, since the ambassador rightly said these referenda are nightmares, the idea of having referenda on European treaties was actually invented by President Mitterrand, taken up by President Chirac. Both of these adventures ended in tears.
Any other reaction?
You know, the topic, the way you put the generational issue is better than the way I put it. It's not a personal thing. It is, and it's not even a generational thing. It is a thematic thing. And your description of Juncker and Schultz talking about the good old days, absolutely, it happens all the time, and it turns young people off. It is, I think, apropos to say that one of the things that accounted for Justin Trudeau's victory was the fact that all the kids, all the 19 to 29 cohort that were supposed to be politically indifferent and actually turned out. If you look at the numbers, they came 50% more in this general election than in the last general election. And it is because a connection was made. And in the United States, where I live half the time and where I work half the time, exactly the same phenomenon is occurring, except, curiously, as you say, the candidates aren't people that they can identify with in any generational adjacency. They lit up for Bernie, and Bernie is no more as far as this campaign is concerned. Will they turn out for Hillary? I don't know. But what the point is, they believe in different things, okay? If you survey their attitudes on environmentalism, on all sorts of things to do with the financial structure as it is, even use the word socialism or capitalism, even in the United States, you'll see a remarkable difference from preceding generations. And unless leaders in Europe understand that about European young people, then they are doomed to fail no matter what they're doing. They have to understand it. They don't have to pander to it, but they have to know it's there, acknowledge it, and to connect to it. I think that's very important.
Okay, we have 90 seconds left. Oliver, you'll have the last question.
Yeah, I'm not sure my rather provocative question is good for 90 seconds, but here you go. Let me play the devil's advocate for a second. You know, you all agreed that the EU is stronger with Britain in it than without it. But those even in favor of the European Union argue that maybe once Britain leaves, the European Union can embark on more ambitious goals because Britain has played traditionally the role of a brakeman. And maybe that it might have actually a positive effect on the very cause of European integration in terms of deepening. But just as I said, you know, a devil's advocate, and maybe you can respond to that.
Thank you. Manfred, you feel in a position to answer such a
I hear your argument, Devil. Would it be not 2016, which in many good ways it is, but in some others it is not. So would it be the year 2000? I would be more inclined to listen to that argument. It is not. We are in the European Union, unfortunately, faced with a number of challenges. None of them is deadly by itself or is something that we can't solve. But this combination of all those and the tendencies in the population to listen to the negative elements rather than the positive parts of the stories, which I do think that the presidents at least put out when they were speaking at the Vatican, when the Karls Prize was awarded to the Pope. The fact that they're listening more to the easy solutions and the negative and scaremongering is a daily recipe for any referendum, even more so than in other circumstances. So I think we need Britain in. We need a clear signal by Britain at this stage saying no matter what, if we draw the bottom line, then there is a good reason for us to stay. And in a way, Brits are pragmatists. So I still tend to believe that the referendum will be pro-Europe.
Let me make one point, Oliver. I'm the one person who can speak frankly here. So there's a more volatile question behind your question. And that is, you see, what has happened in the last 30 years? It used to be that there were 4 countries which had the same population: Britain, France, West Germany, and Italy. Today, there is one country that's bigger than all the others, very much bigger. And before, Germany was reluctant to assert itself politically, and now it's not. If you take Britain out of the mix, you've got a European composition in which Germany is absolutely the dominant country. I don't know if that's a good thing or not a good thing, but it's a new fact, and for the French, it will be a very melancholy fact, let me tell you. So I would throw that out as being something that people think of but don't talk about.
Geoffrey, very last word.
Just very last word. Whatever happens, and I tend to the view just expressed by Manfred, that there's a certain pragmatic solution whereby we may not, British people, I don't mean we in this room, may not love the European Union, but on balance, I think that British people will come down in favor of staying in, quite differently, but possibly the same as in 1975 when over 2/3 voted to stay in, when there was the same excitement a few months before. But it's not going to be the end of the story. On the one hand, you have one of the would-be presidential candidates, of which there are many in the current French government, saying, oh, we need a new constitution for the European Union anyway, which presumably would spark another referendum. We've seen what happened in the Netherlands with the vote on Ukraine, and there is already a most remarkable referendum scheduled in Hungary on the issue of implementing a decision of the European Union, which was taken in correct form with regard to the sharing out of refugees among the member states of the European Union. The Prime Minister of Hungary has decided to have a referendum, presumably to give himself a mandate to destroy that policy, which would have risky consequences for the continuation of Europe's response to the refugee crisis. So whatever happens, I think there are rough waters ahead because of many unresolved issues, but certainly on balance, there's an overwhelming case for Britain to remain within the EU. It's shared by not only President Obama, the Prime Minister of Japan also joined in yesterday, each one doing so in terms of their own national interest. And so for Britons to realize that way of looking at things is a good thing. Just one word on the event in Rome with the Pope. What I read about it, now you said we have to listen to it all, in the New York Times was that all 3 presidents were fairly downbeat and seemed to have a fairly realistic view of the dimensions of the problems facing the European Union. So I didn't detect the complacency which you seem to have picked up.
Très bien. Messieurs, merci. Merci d'avoir partagé avec nous vos impressions et vos analyses. Merci à tous et à toutes. Je vous souhaite une bonne après-midi, mais tout d'abord, je pense qu'il convient de vous remercier chaleureusement par nos applaudissements. And run for your panels, because I think they're starting right now.